Hello, this is going to be today a brief, very brief, but important philosophical lecture on my critique of Kantianism, or the perennial philosophy of Immanuel Kant, the German Enlightenment German idealist philosopher. Um, critique of pure reason um, during different times in my life, um, varying degrees throughout my life, but I first had contacted it in 2011, so I didn't understand too much of it, probably like 40%. I was very, very early adolescent at that time. So I just want to say that the first argument or I would make is that if knowledge doesn't exist because of phenomenological cradalism, which means that every single objective second or even nanosecond of plane length, millisecond of perception we ever have, is constantly changing by hexing quiddity and underlying eigenvalues of ontological substance. It becomes then the question of how the ontological categories, the Kantian tradition, such as these prolegomena too, even come into fruition and to being with the Heideggerian whimsical way of phrasing it. So I think that from a minority and nihilist regard in ontological categories, they may adopt an ontological nihilist approach in which they may they may they may argue that ontological principles or ontological meta axioms are limited exclusively to this particular possible world, as usually is a contingent kind of multimodal distribution of wave function classes. And I think that I might argue that there are a lot of possible worlds where the principles of perception that constitute empirical judgments that can make about external reality, well, if you torque external reality 360 degrees inside out, becomes a question of how does knowledge neurologically aggregate itself at the neurologically nihilistic level, and I think that this whole notion of the reality behind all possible realities. Anyways, I'm on vacation, but this sorry. But anyways, now if you want to divide all possible perceptions to categories, it becomes a question: how does perception even ontologically establish itself as analyticism or synestheticism? If how do we know that first of all it's an external world and the solipsistic world simultaneously exist? And how do we know if anything is objective if objectivity itself is kind of like an ontologically indeterminate status? And I don't want to say kind of, but that kind of implies fuzzy logic degrees. But depends whether you take, Boolean many worlds or fuzzy logic possible worlds. And which one more probably represents external reality more, I don't know. I'm agnostic about that metaphysically. So I argue that, therefore, if you could argue that there is no top-down methods of perception that anchor themselves into an external reality that can then constitute the perceptions kind of being reduced back into substance ontology of our brain, which then, is kind of in a constant Hegelian dialectical cycle between external reality, which is grounded in physical eternal laws that existed before the Greek Kant, versus the ever-changing radicalness of constant fatalism and perception. So ultimately, I think that the notion of there being a critique of Kantianism would be that we don't know if we live in an exclusively Jungian possible world. If a quantum swampland by a thought experiment were to be transplanted in the size of our entire universe, and in terms of size and volumes, spatial reality, width, height, we don't know, if these conditions would still remain. And I think that it becomes the next question of why is perception said to be axiomatic at all, according to Kant, rather. So I think that Kant was a very systematic thinker, but he argued in favor of the realism of sequential logicism, the way kind of the modality of Wittgenstein did. So I think, and I think that Kant wanted to kind of constitute a meta system, though he did write about sequentialism too, but primarily ontology. But it becomes a question of if the ontology itself can fully encapsulate not only moral obligation, but moral quantum luck and moral Bayesian and Boolean reason and fuzzy logic systems that kind of border moral obligation, but are more like artifact of moral culture. And eternally, I also want to say that in the end, I think that Kant argued in favor of kind of this transcendence and triumphancy of metaphysical empiricism, which is the metaphysics of the empiricism of both external and Platonic realms of ultimate synthesia and also analytic realities. And there, I think that in the end, I conclude that Kant, if you take, all possible pair consistent or contrapositive kind of inverted notions of his logic system, of course, kind of common to Socratic-like heuristic. But if you also just merely argue in favor of non-hierarchical but transworld identity in which ontological hierarchies and ontological meta-axioms and meta-mathematics and even meta-morality don't exist because of their nihilistic status or even indeterminate status, which itself might not pass a possible Turing machines, which are located in quantum mobs in our universe. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope this really inspired you to kind of devise your own or make your own critique of the foundations of Kant, Immanuel Kant. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.